An important part of ensuring the validity of our results is managing response quality. We can do this under the progress header on the response quality page. Here we can find different data quality checks, which we can use to screen out responses that fail the data quality thresholds that we set. And we can also find charts that give us an overall picture about the data quality, the consistency of our responses, and how much time people took to make trade-offs. We can use these charts as a guide to help us identify reasonable data quality thresholds for filtering out responses. So let's talk about the response quality settings. We can filter out responses based on inconsistency, which excludes people who performed poorly on our consistency check. So in other words, people who showed inconsistency in their judgment regarding the same trade-off. We can also filter out people who always clicked the same button during the survey, so they probably didn't take the survey very seriously. And we can filter out people who answered questions too quickly, which means they probably didn't put much thought into the trade-offs. You can toggle any of these exclusions on or off before or after publishing your survey, and also while you're still gathering responses. Once you have gathered all the responses you want, we do recommend that you have all of these checks enabled in order to ensure reliability and validity of your results. Now, as I mentioned, we can use the charts on this page to guide how strict or lenient we want to be with our response quality checks. Here, for example, we see how many of our completed responses pass or fail our current data quality checks, and therefore how many will be included or excluded for analysis in our results. So here we have around 5,000 total responses, of which around 3,000 will be included in our results analysis, and 2,000 will be excluded because they failed these response quality checks that are listed here. This gives us a good idea of the overall quality of our responses, but also if maybe there's a need to fine-tune the thresholds for our quality checks. For example, are too many responses being excluded from our results with our current settings? Or is the number of excluded responses very low, which means we should double check that all the responses we're including for analysis are of sufficient quality. To help us determine what thresholds to set for our quality checks, we can use the remaining charts for guidance. Let's start with the participant consistency chart. As a reminder, 1000 Minds checks for consistency by repeating up to 3 trade-off questions during the survey depending on your settings, and here we can see how consistent people's responses were when presented with the same trade-offs. In my case, I chose to only repeat 2 trade-off questions, and most of my survey participants answered both of these trade-offs consistently. About a quarter were inconsistent in one of their answers, and 9% were inconsistent in both answers. But since most of my respondents did pass both consistency checks, I think it's fine for me to exclude responses after just one inconsistency, because that way I can improve the reliability of my results without sacrificing too many responses. So I'll enter that setting in a drop-down here. Next, let's look at the minimum time taken per trade-off. If we have the 100% stacking option toggled on, we will see the yellow line showing the number of participants that had a minimum trade-off time in the time intervals displayed on the horizontal axis. The bars show us the proportion of consistent responses within each of those time intervals. In a large dataset like this, you will usually see that as minimum trade-off time increases, so does the level of consistency in people's responses, because the longer people take to answer trade-offs, the more time they spend thinking about the question. But even if you have a smaller dataset and you don't see a clear pattern, this graph might still be useful for examining how consistent or reliable people's responses are based on minimum trade-off time. Now, if we turn off 100% stacking, we see the absolute number of participant responses and consistent responses corresponding to each minimum trade-off time. So it's still the same information, it's just a different view. Based on these results, I think 2.5 seconds for the minimum trade-off time seems like a reasonable cutoff, because that's when we start to see an increase in the number of total and consistent responses. And if we toggle 100% stacking again, we see that that's where we start to get about 2/3 of responses passing both consistency checks. For the median trade-off time, it's the same idea. We can see that at an average trade-off time of around 5 seconds, we start to get around 2/3 of our respondents passing both consistency checks. When we look at this view, it does still seem that 5 or 6 seconds can be a good cutoff because we see that that's around where the number of responses increases. So that means it takes at least that long on average to properly think through a trade-off question. But again, remember, there's no true hard limit about what's right or what's wrong. You might want to select a higher cutoff or a lower cutoff. It's up to you. So let's say I've decided to exclude responses from people who have a minimum trade-off time of less than 2.5 seconds and a median trade-off time of less than 5 seconds. So I put in those values here, and then I update the charts, and now I see an updated summary of how many responses are excluded from our results analysis. Of course, you can keep playing around and fine-tuning these limits until you find a balance that you're satisfied with. Now, the last thing we can look at on this page to think about response quality is this chart, which shows us the number of trade-offs that people had to make in order to complete the survey. Just like with the other charts, we can toggle between two different views. Then we can examine whether people who made more trade-offs might have possibly become fatigued and less engaged, which would have led to greater rates of inconsistency in those cases. In this case, we actually see the opposite. People who answered fewer trade-offs have less consistency in their responses. This might be because maybe they clicked the "they're equal" button for a lot of the trade-offs because they weren't sure how to answer them. And choosing "they're equal" decreases the number of trade-offs that need to be made. So that would explain why the fewer trade-offs you see that people answered, the greater their inconsistency. This is just something interesting to think about when it comes to considering the participant experience and thinking about whether that might have had any effect on the quality of our responses. So there you go. That's how you can examine and control for data quality in 1000 Minds.